Hey guys! Tonight, we're going to do that very relaxing thing where we take an objectively disturbing historical topic and talk about it in the most soothing voice imaginable. So if you're ready to unwind, dim the lights, hug your pillow, and let your neurons melt just a little. Welcome back to another 2 hours of Why Were Medieval Royals Like This? Tonight's episode is about medieval hostage children. Not the dramatic movie type, but the quiet, painfully awkward political kind, where a child barely old enough to spell his own name is suddenly expected to uphold international peace. Because of course he was. Medieval diplomacy loved nothing more than saying, "Sure, we trust you. But also give us your son." So let's float gently into this world of tiny political chess pieces. Raised in castles far from home, eating unfamiliar porridge, and trying their best not to trigger a war. The vibe, calm, political babysitting. To set the tone, imagine being 8 years old. You're playing in the mud, minding your own business. And suddenly your father, who loves war just a little too much, tells you that you're going to spend the next decade living with his enemies. He calls it peace. You call it anxiety. And medieval Europe calls it a hostage arrangement. Though they preferred the elegant term, a guarantee of good behavior. These kids didn't get dramatic chains or dark dungeons. Oh no, Europeans saved that effort for adults. Hostage children usually lived in luxury. But don't worry, it was the emotionally confusing kind of luxury. They had fine clothes, expensive tutors, and more bread than they ever had back home. But also the constant knowledge that one bad decision, by someone else, not even them, could end very badly. You know, a very soothing bedtime topic. Let's drift to our first hostage child, Prince William of Scotland. Prince William, the son of King James I of Scotland, is a perfect example of medieval parenting where the bar was on the floor. William was given to the English as a child hostage. After one of those classic Anglo-Scottish, "We're fighting again because we don't know how to stop." The English basically said, "Keep your father in line, or else." William arrived in England with the medieval equivalent of an overnight bag and a lifetime supply of diplomatic pressure. He was placed in a beautiful castle, fed extremely well, trained by England's best tutors, and monitored by more guards than a medieval zoo. He lived like royalty, because he was royalty. But he also lived like a human insurance policy, which he was. Prince William wasn't mistreated, but he wasn't free either. His morning routine went something like, wake up, pray, study, exist as leverage, go to bed. It was very structured. The English kept him safe, because losing him would start a war. And nobody had the budget for that level of drama. A quick sip of snarky context. A fun, but also not fun, fact. Medieval royals trusted each other about as much as we trust spam emails. So sending children as hostages wasn't considered cruel. It was considered responsible. Like, of course I handed my son over. I'm a king, not a lunatic. And other kings responded with, yes, absolutely. Very reasonable. Here's my daughter. Enjoy. This was international cooperation at its finest. The daily life of a medieval hostage kid. Let's glide gently into their daily lifestyle, which was basically a calm blend of tutoring, etiquette, and being silently judged by everyone around them. Most hostage children were treated, well, surprisingly nicely. They were fed better than normal kids. They were clothed better. They learned fancy languages they didn't ask for. They were trained in court etiquette they didn't understand. And they were expected to write letters back home like, yes, mother, England is lovely. Yes, mother, I'm still alive. Please remind father not to start any wars. Sincerely, your anxious son. Their schedule floated between studying Latin, learning court manners, practicing sword drills, trying very hard not to cause an international incident. And honestly, a decent number of them grew attached to their captors. Not in a Stockholm Syndrome way, but in a, wow, this castle has central heating and my home doesn't, kind of way. Medieval politics were confusing. Hostages, who had to be charming. This is one of the funniest parts. Hostage kids were often expected to charm the court. Imagine being 10 years old, and everyone around you is like, alright, kid. Your dad might invade next week. So smile more. Show them you're worth keeping alive. And the child is standing there, trying to look politically adorable. Royal childhood was exhausting. A floaty moved to another case, John, Duke of Bedford's hostages. John, Duke of Bedford. A man with far too much political stress. And a forehead the size of Normandy. Held multiple French noble children as hostages. During the 100 Years' War. Again, no chains. Just expensive shoes, roast dinners, and constant pressure. These French children lived in English castles, surrounded by luxuries they did not trust. They often wrote letters home like, hello, father. The English keep feeding me. I don't know how to feel about that. Some of them even grew up more English than French. A detail that annoyed France so deeply, that France considered this a form of psychological warfare. And honestly, they weren't wrong. How the host families treated them. Hostage children were meant to be honored guests, but with the subtle flavor of behave or else. Their host families treated them heavy checkmark politely, heavy checkmark carefully, heavy checkmark and with a lot of passive-aggressive compliments. The children often ate at the same table as their captor's family, sat in the same room during diplomatic meetings, and learned how to act like miniature diplomats. not because they wanted to, but because medieval politics said, "You're 8. Time to carry international peace on your tiny shoulders. Punishment without punishment." Here's the calm, disturbing twist. Even though they were treated well, the punishment for their parents' rebellion was their continued captivity. That's it. No torture. Just years of living in a castle they couldn't leave. It was a soft punishment. The medieval version of a very long grounding. And occasionally, if their parents broke a treaty, the hostage child's life became complicated. Not violently complicated. Just, your room is smaller and we're watching you 24/7, complicated. The kind of psychological discomfort that medieval nobles didn't consider abuse, because they lacked functioning empathy, emotional reality, confusion as a lifestyle. Hostage kids often lived between two worlds, beloved by their captors, but also political leverage, missing their homes, but also liking the comfort of their new life, raised by foreign tutors, but expected to stay loyal to their homeland. They grew up bilingual, confused, and diplomatically exhausted, which is probably why so many of them grew into very strange adults, who made very strange political decisions. Medieval Europe was really just one big dysfunctional family. Let's float to the next section. And with that gentle drift through the daily lives of Europe's most stressed out noble children, let's slide softly into another story of medieval political babysitting. Alright, settle back in. Take another slow breath. And let's drift even deeper into the quietly uncomfortable world of medieval hostage children, who didn't ask for any of this, but somehow became the glue holding entire kingdoms together. Tonight we float gently to another set of small, historically stressed individuals who carried more political responsibility than most adults do today. Because, of course they did. This next section takes us into the Anglo-French hostage exchange system, which was essentially a centuries-long parent-teacher conference that got way out of hand. The softest kind of imprisonment. To ease into the next story, imagine a royal childhood that feels like winning a very luxurious prison sentence. You have rich clothes, but you didn't choose them. You eat good food, but someone is always watching your plate. You roam a castle, but not too far. And everyone pretends you are a guest, but no one lets you go home. That's the medieval hostage experience in one neat little emotional crisis. Let's glide over to one of the most famous cases from the 100 Years' War. The hostage sons of King Charles VI of France. A family with more problems than answers. King Charles VI, also known as Charles the Mad, because medieval Europe named people with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, had a long-standing habit of losing wars and making treaties That required giving away his own children as hostages. Now, to be fair, his episodes of madness included believing he was made of glass. So decision-making wasn't exactly his core strength. His sons, especially young Louis and Jean, spent years being politely held in English custody. Not harmed. Not tortured. Just supervised. Very, very supervised. Picture a childhood where your caretakers constantly say, "You're safe with us, little one. Unless your dad does something stupid." And their dad always did something stupid. Daily life under English hospitality. Louis and Jean lived in English noble households, where their hosts tried their best to act warm and friendly, while also silently reciting the medieval version of "Please don't escape, I don't want to start a war." Their routine looked like morning prayers, lessons in Latin, French, and English, sword practice, political pressure, dinner, polite anxiety, bedtime. They were given tutors so strict that even modern private schools would say, "Relax." They were expected to behave like living proof of their father's loyalty, which, unfortunately, was optimism at best. Louis apparently became so well adapted to English manners and English food that his letters home read like a child who had mixed feelings about being rescued. Something like, "Dear Mother, England is cold, but the bread is very good. Please tell Father not to declare war again. Sincerely, your hostage son." This was medieval diplomacy at its peak. White medium star, the soft threat of "We're not angry, just disappointed." One of the strangest aspects of hostage life is how passive-aggressive the whole thing was. If France broke a treaty, England didn't always punish the children physically. That was considered tacky. Instead, they might reduce the child servants, limit their play area, take away their tutors, make them stay inside, occasionally remove their fancy clothes, or simply tell them, "Your father has displeased the king," which, emotionally speaking, is a 10/10 medieval guilt trip. Imagine being 11 and learning that the fate of an entire kingdom depends on whether your dad keeps his temper. It's like being grounded for something your father said on Twitter. Next case, the Norwegian hostage boys in Scotland. Nordic calm meets Scottish chaos. Let's drift north for a minute to a case that history remembers, mostly because nobody seemed emotionally prepared. In the 1200s, Norway and Scotland made a treaty that required Norway to send 2 young boys, actually noble hostages, to the Scottish court. These boys arrived dressed in traditional Norwegian wool, probably smelling faintly of fish and sea air, and were immediately dropped into Scottish court culture, which was significantly louder. Their letters home, the few surviving notes, suggest two themes. 1. The Scots keep feeding us things we don't understand. 2. We would like to go home now. One of the boys spent years in custody because the Norwegians couldn't agree whether the treaty was a good idea or a questionable life choice. Meanwhile, Scotland treated them reasonably well because, again, everyone pretended. This was totally normal political behavior. White medium star hostages used as diplomatic exchange students. You'll notice a pattern here. Medieval hostage children were basically right arrow luxury prisoners, right arrow political leverage, right arrow and cultural exchange students. All at the same time. They learned languages, sword fighting, etiquette, and how to quietly panic whenever someone mentioned border dispute. They also grew up with peculiar identity issues. For example, a French hostage raised in England might grow up loving English food, English fashion, and English manners, and then be returned to France and told to hate everything English. The emotional whiplash was profound. This is probably why medieval noble families were so dramatic. Bad childhoods make for very spicy adult politics. Let's glide to a new set of hostages, noble girls. Because medieval sexism was always on the menu. We've talked a lot about boys. So now we'll float into the world of noble girls taken as hostages. A world that looks similar on the surface, but with an extra layer of giant expectations and zero personal freedom. Girls were often held as hostages to guarantee marriage alliances, tribute payments, or the good behavior of their male relatives. Because men caused 99% of medieval problems. A noble girl hostage usually lived in the queen's household, where she learned embroidery, etiquette, court diplomacy, and how to survive. The medieval equivalent of a passive-aggressive workplace. She wasn't mistreated, but she also wasn't allowed to relax. Queens typically used hostage girls as practice daughters, teaching them how to behave, how to sit, how to not be embarrassing at royal dinners, and how to deal with nobles who dressed like walking curtains. A few of these girls became so beloved that when the time came to release them, the queens actually cried, which was sweet. In a mildly dysfunctional way. White medium star: The Strange Case of Lady Margaret of Norway. The child who became a diplomatic puzzle. One of the most famous hostage-like situations was Lady Margaret, the Maid of Norway, who was technically not a hostage, but lived a life that looked suspiciously similar. She was the heir to the Scottish throne, and was shipped across countries as a child political pawn, while adults argued about treaties, marriages, and who got to control Scotland next. Margaret spent most of her short life in a foreign court, being treated like the world's smallest political football. Every letter about her was written in the calm, emotionless tone of medieval diplomacy. The girl is well. The girl is learning. The girl is valuable. Not helpful comments for a child, but very on brand for the Middle Ages. She died before returning to Scotland, turning her entire existence into a case study on how medieval politics never let children simply be children. White medium star food, clothing, and daily comforts. Let's float into something more grounded. The material lifestyle of hostage children. Because these kids often lived better than most nobles. Their clothing, finely woven wool, linen, silk. Whatever their captors wanted to flaunt. Their food, roasted meats, baked breads, sweet wine sauces. Hostage children had healthier diets than the vast majority of Europe. Their rooms, not dungeons, more like uncomfortable luxury suites, with embroidered curtains, and servants who addressed them as my lord or my lady, while also making sure they didn't run away. Their toys. Yes, they had those too. Wooden horses, small dolls. Board games like Nine Men's Morris. And occasionally pet falcons. Because rich medieval people were strange. But all of it existed under a constant cloud of your life is great as long as your father behaves. Truly relaxing. White medium star and now the emotional toll. Despite the nice clothes and good food, the emotional impact was real. Hostage kids lived years without seeing their parents. Often they forget their home language. They grew attached to new caretakers. They developed strange hybrid identities. Some became angrier. Some became quieter. A few became surprisingly loyal to their captors instead. A French boy, raised in England, famously wrote home, "I feel French in my sleep, but English in the day," which is poetic. In a mildly tragic way. Let's drift toward our next cases. And with that, we gently close today's chapter of noble sons and daughters who lived in the in-between spaces of medieval politics. Ready for part 3, where we explore hostage children who became future rulers, the surprising friendships they formed, emotional breakdowns, and how some kids returned home and immediately became political disasters. Okay, so, medieval kings had a wonderful little hobby. Take someone else's children, keep them for years, and then act surprised when things went wrong. Classic. By this point in our story, you already know the basics. Hostages weren't prisoners. They were leverage. Living, breathing diplomatic tokens. But part 3 is about something darker. What happened to the children who, well, didn't make it back home? Because yes, many of them never returned. Not because they were killed, but because life inside a foreign royal court changed them forever. Let's walk through that. Slow. Quiet. Dark. New Moon 1. The hostages who forgot where they came from. Imagine being taken away at age 6. You arrive at a massive stone castle. Everyone speaks a different language. The food tastes weird. The king calls you, my little guarantee, which is a totally normal thing to call a child. Over time, things happen. You pick up the language. You learn the royal customs. You start wearing their clothes. You start spending time with their knights. You start liking the new luxuries. And slowly, your old life fades. Many medieval hostage kids didn't return because they no longer identified with the home they came from. They essentially became foreign nobles wearing someone else's bloodline. And oh boy, that caused problems. New Moon 2. Used as political marriage pieces. Once these hostage kids grew up, they weren't kids anymore. They were educated, well-trained, fluent in noble behavior, useful. And nothing screams useful to a medieval king more than a marriage pawn. So what did kings do? They married hostage children into their own families. Yes. The same children they took as insurance. Now they're suddenly beloved sons-in-law. Because nothing says peace like marrying your hostage to your niece. Absolutely romantic. Many children never return home because they married into the foreign kingdom. And their old kingdom, well, they didn't always want them back anymore. New Moon 3. Some became loyal to their captors. Here's the part that medieval parents hated. Sometimes the children ended up liking the foreign king more than their birth father. Why? Because they were treated better in the new court. They received more education. They had better food. They were surrounded by culture, books, warriors. They felt respected for the first time. So when the original kingdom asked for their loyal son or daughter back, the response was basically, actually, I think I'm good here. Imagine losing your child to political kidnapping, only to have them willingly stay with the kidnapper. That happened more often than you think. New Moon 4. The darkest fate, becoming a hostage king. Here's the nightmare scenario. Some kids grew up inside a foreign kingdom. And then that kingdom used them to control their own homeland. This is when things got brutally complicated. A child raised by one king, sent back home to rule, but secretly loyal to the other king. They were essentially a royal puppet, a king with the wrong heart, a ruler for someone else's benefit. This happened in medieval England, France, the Ottoman Empire, the Mongol Khanates, even ancient India and Persia. It was messy. Their own people distrusted them. Their new kingdom used them. Their old kingdom resented them. These kids weren't children anymore. They were weapons wearing a crown. New Moon 5. And yes, some just disappeared. It wasn't common. But it's part of the story. Some children died from disease. Some vanished in wars. Some were quietly removed when tensions rose. But in royal records, these events were always written nicely, like passed peacefully in their sleep, which in medieval language could mean absolutely anything. Candle Part 3 Summary, in one sleepy line. Most medieval hostage children didn't return home because they were reshaped, rewired, and repurposed by the foreign courts that took them. Hey everyone! Tonight we're doing something a little cozy, a little claustrophobic. And honestly, just a little bit musty. We're going inside a medieval castle. Not the movie kind. Not the sparkling, tourist gift shop kind. I mean the actual, cold, stone-walled, smoky, slightly damp version that real medieval people lived in. And then, we're going to trap ourselves inside it. Because tonight's topic is what happens inside a castle during a siege, minute by minute. Which is basically medieval Big Brother. Except instead of voting contestants out, everyone's just hoping they don't starve. And instead of drama, there's, well, mostly silence, boredom, hunger, and mild panic. So if that sounds fun, go ahead, dim the lights, stretch your back a little, and settle in. We're going to move very slowly through this. Almost like we're walking through the castle halls wearing medieval socks. You know, those wool things that probably never got washed. And smelled like history. Sparkles the calm hour, minute 0 to 60. Before any siege properly begins. There's this strange, almost peaceful hour. Where everyone pretends it's fine. The sun rises. The birds chirp. The castle guards open the wooden gates. Scratch their beards, yawn. And wonder whether today will finally be the day. They stop having trench foot. People inside go about their morning like usual. A blacksmith pounding metal. A cook yelling about burnt porridge. Someone arguing over a chicken. A monk trying to pray but secretly annoyed at everyone. Just normal castle ambience. And then, someone spots movement outside the walls. A group of riders. A banner. Maybe a whole army slowly crawling across the landscape. Like an unwanted in-law coming to stay longer than planned. Someone rings the warning bell. Not dramatically, this isn't a movie. Just tiredly, like, yep, here we go again. It's the medieval equivalent of a weather alert. Except instead of a storm, it's a bunch of men with pointy sticks who want to ruin your entire month. Sparkles the closing of the gates, minute 60 to 120. The gates slam shut. And you would think this would be a big, heroic moment. Nope. Mostly it's just wood scraping against stone. And a guard muttering, "Why does this thing always get stuck?" People inside the castle take stock. Who made it in? Who's stuck outside? Who left their ox wandering around? And which unlucky peasant is about to blame God for everything? Meanwhile, the lord of the castle comes out, usually wearing a fur cloak. And having that, "I slept 2 hours and ate bread with sadness" look. He says something formal like, "Prepare for a siege," which is medieval for, "We're about to be very hungry for a very long time." Everybody nods quietly because they already know. Sparkles the first panic, hour 3. The attacking army takes its positions outside. They're not rushing. They're not charging. They're not yelling. They're just settling in and unpacking their tents, like they're setting up for a medieval picnic. People inside the castle start panicking anyway. Not loudly. Just doing little behaviors like hoarding food, whispering rumors, checking their water barrels, looking at each other like, who's going to get eaten first? Children cry. Pigs squeal. Someone complains that they were supposed to have laundry day. And everyone keeps asking the same question. How long is this going to last? The answer, historically, was always longer than you want. Sparkles the Lord's speech, hour 4. Every siege script includes this moment. The lord or lady stands on the steps of the great hall and gives a speech. Not a motivational one. Not a rousing one. Just a very practical one. Something like, "We have enough food for 3 months. If nobody eats too much. And if the rats don't get into it. And if God feels like being kind this year." He usually wasn't. Then he explains the rules. No wasting water. No hoarding food. No leaving the latrine pits open. And no talking to the enemy messengers. Because they lie. And also they're annoying. Everyone nods. Half the people ignore him immediately. Sparkles inside the castle, hour 5, the smell. Okay, let's talk about the smell. Because if we're doing this, minute by minute, we have to acknowledge it. Castles smelled like fireplaces. Wet wool. Stale beer. Animals. And the emotional exhaustion of 100 peasants. Trapped in one stone box. Now add hundreds more bodies. Never enough fresh water. No one allowed to leave. And fierce sweat. And smoke from torches. And bread that was already moldy before the siege even started. The smell becomes historic. Archaeologists talk about layers of soil. Sieged castles had layers of smell. And nobody escaped it. Sparkles the routine begins, hours 6 to 12. A castle under siege falls into a rhythm. Not a fun one. Just a rhythm. Guards rotate on the wall. Archers nap whenever they can. Children poke each other out of boredom. People pray a little more than usual. A cook tries to stretch food rations. Like an early medieval contestant on Master Chef, Famine Edition. And everyone waits. If you think a siege is constant fighting, it's not. It's mostly waiting. Waiting for the attackers to do something. Waiting for internal drama. Waiting for food to run out. Waiting for literally anything to happen. The first day of a siege is mostly people realizing they're stuck in the world's worst Airbnb with no checkout date. The first night, hour 12 to 24. The sun goes down. And with it, morale. People huddle in common halls. Children curl up near fires. Dogs bark at every little noise. The guards on the walls grip their spears. A little tighter because everything sounds more threatening at night. Inside, people whisper. Whispering is the soundtrack of a siege. No one wants to say anything out loud. Instead, they mutter anxieties like, what if they cut off the water? Do we really have enough grain? Is it true the enemy has a trebuchet? What if the tunnels under the castle collapse? Does anyone know what that smell is? The Lord tries to sleep. The people definitely don't. Someone snores too loudly. Someone else throws a shoe at them. And that's just night one. There are going to be so many more. New Moon, end of part 1. Part 2 will continue the next section. The slow decay, hunger, boredom, the strange routines, and how people actually passed each day inside a trapped fortress. Hey friends, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you're drifting off already, honestly, that's the correct way to watch this channel. So, let's float back inside our slightly miserable, slightly smelly medieval castle, and ease into the next stretch of our very calm siege. Nothing dramatic. Just a gentle tour of discomfort. The morning after the first night, where everyone tries to act normal. So the sun comes up. Not that it matters. The castle walls are so thick that sunrise feels more like someone turned up the brightness one notch, very politely. Inside, people wake up the way medieval people always woke up. Confused, sore, and slightly annoyed at existence. Servants stretch on wooden floors. Knights wake up with armor-shaped indentations on their bodies. And nobles, of course, claim they didn't sleep at all, even though they clearly did. This is a noble tradition that still survives today. Breakfast is generous word. Let's go with edible survival material. If the siege just began, food is still somewhat normal. You might get a chunk of yesterday's bread that doubles as a blunt weapon. Some cold porridge. And maybe cheese that is already developing a personality. People try not to talk about rationing yet. There is a sort of unspoken agreement to pretend everything is completely fine. Like, oh, those enemy soldiers outside. Ah yes, charming scenery. Do you think they'll go home after lunch? maybe they're just visiting. This phase lasts about 2 days. At most. Medieval hygiene, or the lack of it. Let's talk about bathing. Or rather, the near-total absence of bathing. A castle under siege becomes a kind of aromatherapy experience. Just not the kind you'd want. There are about 300 to 800 people inside, depending on the castle. All sweating, cooking, sleeping, crying, eating, panicking, and occasionally leaking emotions, and other things. Baths still exist. Technically. But water is precious now. And most people don't want to risk using too much of it, because you never know if you're going to need that bucket for drinking, or putting out a fire, or chasing a slightly too aggressive rat. So yes, the smell builds slowly. Very slowly. Like a gentle medieval fog of humanity. Nobles sometimes get a bucket of warm water if they're lucky. Servants, meanwhile, wash their faces with optimism and call it a day. Daily jobs. Now slightly more depressing. People still have roles. The castle doesn't stop functioning just because there are unwanted guests outside. The blacksmith keeps working. Why? Because there are always arrows to fix, armor to adjust, and metal that must be hammered loudly enough to remind everyone that time still exists. The cook becomes the second most stressed person alive. They must stretch the food supply like it's medieval yoga. Every new meal is announced with, "We're experimenting today." AKA, we're throwing whatever we found into a pot and hoping it doesn't kill anyone. Servants run around as always. They just complain quietly instead of loudly. It's one of the few freedoms they have. The guards rotate shifts on the walls. And honestly, they have the best view. Not the best job, but the best view. The enemy camps below look like a chaotic medieval festival, minus the music and the joy. Guards watch them cook, sharpen swords, play dice, argue, nap, and occasionally yell things like, "Surrender." To which castle guards reply, "No thank you." Medieval diplomacy at its peak. Minute by minute, afternoon quiet. The most unsettling time. Afternoons during a siege are strangely calm. The enemy soldiers have already had breakfast, argued about something trivial, and settled into boredom. Inside the castle, things are equally non-eventful. A mother rocks a crying child, telling them that everything is okay. Which is medieval parenting for, I have no idea what's happening. Old men sit by the fire and share stories about sieges they definitely survived in the past. Even though they absolutely did not. Traders count their goods. Which won't matter in a week. But it helps with stress. And in the middle of all this, someone always tries to keep themselves busy with tasks like mending clothes, repairing shoes, arguing over firewood, sweeping dust that doesn't matter, moving things from one room to another for no reason. People pretend these tasks are important, even when they are absolutely not. It's how humans cope. by keeping their hands busy so their minds don't ask inconvenient questions. The low-level anxiety everyone pretends isn't there. There is a specific type of anxiety that only exists inside a besieged castle. It's not dramatic. It's not panic. It's more like this constant, background thought. I hope we don't all slowly starve to death. Anyway, back to weaving baskets. Everyone carries this feeling around. Even the children notice it. Kids still play. But their games slowly shift into siege-themed versions. Like, throw rocks at imaginary invaders. Count how many soldiers have funny hats. Try to sneak food without getting caught. Pretend to be a guard and fall off a barrel. Medieval childhood was creative. Let's float over to the nobles section. Ah yes, the nobles. The VIP section of the siege. They occupy the upper floors, where the rooms are still terrible, but not sleeping next to livestock terrible. Nobles handle the siege with a stunning combination of denial, complaining, writing letters, eating slightly better food, and loudly sighing whenever anything inconveniences them. They also hold meetings. So many meetings. Meetings about food, water, morale, diplomacy, and occasionally about which servant should be blamed for something they didn't do. One noble inevitably suggests, "Perhaps we should negotiate." Another noble replies, "No, that sounds like effort." So, they don't. Night comes again, soft, slow, and slightly worse than yesterday. As the sun goes down, everyone prepares for another quiet medieval night, which is never truly quiet. Inside the castle, fires are lit. People gather in corners. A bard tries to play music and immediately regrets it. Someone snores loudly enough to echo across the great hall. Outside, the enemy soldiers also settle in. They sing songs, drink whatever passes as alcohol, and talk loudly about how they will definitely win tomorrow. Even though tomorrow will be exactly like today. The castle walls absorb all the night sounds. Footsteps. Whispers. The shifting of armor. Crackling torches. Distant laughter from the enemy camp. The occasional, "Is that a rat?" But still, the night feels manageable. Things are tense, yes. But still stable. Not comfortable. Just stable. As people drift to sleep, the siege continues without anyone realizing it. People lie down wherever they can. On hay piles. Next to fires. In cramped chambers. On cold stone floors. Under makeshift blankets that were probably meant for horses. And for a few hours, the castle becomes almost peaceful. Almost. You can still hear the wind passing through arrow slits. The quiet hum of human bodies packed together. The long, slow breathing of 100 people trying not to think too hard. This is the calm phase of a siege. The part where people start to slowly adjust to their new strange life. The danger isn't what's outside. The real danger is the routine. The silent boredom. The slow erosion of morale. But that's a worry for another night. For now, people rest. Because tomorrow will be the same. Just slightly hungrier. If you want part 3, I'll continue with the exact same sleepy pacing. Food running low. People getting irritable. Nobles losing composure. Weird siege routines. The rise of petty drama. Rats becoming emotional support animals. Hey guys. Tonight, we're drifting into another quiet corner of the past. So, if the lights aren't already dimmed, you might want to do that. Maybe settle a little deeper into whatever blanket cocoon you've crafted for yourself. Because this episode is going to glide through one of history's soft, shadowy spaces, the lives of women who were left behind when their warriors didn't come home. Not the queens, not the mythic heroines, not the famous tragedies you've already heard 1,000 times. Just the widows. The lonely ones. The forgotten ones. The ones whose names usually never made it into the scrolls, unless they happened to be inconvenient for some king, in which case they were suddenly very important. So yeah, the vibe tonight is quiet. A little melancholic. But in a calm, almost expected way. Because as you know, ancient history is basically one long story of men running off to die for glory, and the women who had to figure out what to do with the laundry afterwards. Let's float into the world of ancient Greece first, because of course we are. This is the same civilization that carved perfect marble statues but couldn't quite figure out emotional support. And right there, tucked in between all the hoplite bravado, you have these women waiting. Sometimes for months. Sometimes for years. Sometimes forever. And the state really expected them to just vibe with it. So let's drift toward one particular widow. Not a famous one. Not a Helen or a Penelope. Penelope was treated like the Beyoncé of loyalty, which is a lot. No, tonight we sink into the quieter lives. The ones with less poetry and more chores. Let's start with a Greek widow from the Peloponnesian War, and yes, before you ask, she does not get a name. Which is very on brand for ancient Greece. A Greek widow from the Peloponnesian War. Imagine a small dimly lit home in a city-state somewhere between Athens and Sparta. We don't know her name, but we do know her situation. She married young, that part wasn't optional. Her husband joined the ranks, that also wasn't optional. And one sunny afternoon he marched off wearing bronze armor that absolutely did not help with ventilation. She probably watched him leave through a doorway that she'd later stand in, a lot. Because nobody in this era had invented coping mechanisms besides wait and maybe cry a little. The Peloponnesian War lasted 27 years. Which is longer than some modern countries have existed. Plenty of men never returned, and for women, that left an entire lifetime of, so, now what? She didn't inherit anything automatically. Ancient Greek law basically said, congrats, you are now the responsibility of your nearest male relative. Which is like being downgraded from wife to household furniture. And if she had sons, well, those sons were probably taken to be future soldiers too. Because the universe has a sense of humor, a very dry, bureaucratic sense of humor. So imagine her life. Waking early, grinding grain, fetching water, listening for war news that probably wasn't good, living in constant emotional limbo. She didn't get to mourn freely. Society expected dignified sadness, which means no dramatic breakdowns, at least not where anyone could see. Because apparently even grief had to follow community guidelines. At night, she might sit by a small oil lamp and stitch fabric. Slowly. Mechanically. Thoughts drifting back to someone she barely had time to know. Someone she expected to grow old with. Someone she probably imagined sitting right next to her, complaining about barley prices. But he wasn't coming home. And the world kept turning. Quietly. Indifferently. The loneliness wasn't sudden, like a thunderbolt. It was soft and gradual, like fog rolling in. A steady awareness that she'd become invisible in her own home. It's not dramatic. It's just ancient life. Let's drift forward a little. A Spartan widow. Now, Spartan society, you'd think this place would treat widows like queens of death metal honor. But nope. Turns out, being a Spartan widow was basically being placed in a societal gray zone where everyone saluted your husband's bravery and then immediately forgot you existed. Spartan men left for war more than they stayed home. So if you were married, the odds were basically one long, loading screen of anxiety. And when the worst happened, the city-state had a simple rule for widows. Congratulations. You now have to remarry. Preferably ASAP. Because Sparta needs more soldiers, please and thank you. Romantic, right? There was no, take your time. No, heal at your own pace. No, maybe consider therapy. Mostly because therapy wasn't invented yet and Sparta would have outlawed it for being too soft. Now picture a Spartan widow who just watched her husband march to Thermopylae. He didn't come back, obviously, because that battle had a 300-0 survival record. She receives the news from a messenger known for emotional delivery skills roughly equivalent to a rock. And then society gives her a pat on the back and says, "He died well. Good for him. Anyway, about your next marriage." She probably didn't even get enough time to finish processing the phrase, "died well," before someone started matchmaking. And remarriage wasn't exactly a joyful event. It was more like a civic duty with extra steps. A heavy cloak of expectation mixed with a lingering sense of betrayal, not by choice, but by circumstance. Every new commitment came with the ghost of the old one. Every child born afterward lived in the shadow of the one who wasn't coming home. Every ordinary day, grinding, weaving, cooking, had a quiet undertone of, this was not the life she imagined. But she kept going. Because that's what Spartan society expected. And in ancient history, expectation usually outweighed emotion. Let's float away from the Greek world now. A Roman widow from the early Republic. Roman culture loved rules. They had laws for everything, including how a widow should behave. So picture a woman in the early Roman Republic, maybe around the 3rd century BCE. Her husband goes off to war. It doesn't matter which war, Rome was basically the never-stop-fighting empire. She waits. And waits. And waits some more. Eventually, a letter arrives. Well, not a letter, this is Rome, more like a carved wooden tablet or a soldier delivering the worst voicemail in history. Her husband has fallen somewhere far away, probably while trying to capture a hill that didn't even want to be captured. Under Roman law, her dowry goes back to her family. She returns to her father's house, which is Roman for, "Hey, welcome back to being treated like a teenage daughter again. Enjoy the downgrade." If she had children, especially sons, they remained with her husband's family because Rome loved confusing custody arrangements. So she becomes this drifting figure, not quite belonging anywhere. Too young to be considered wise. Too quiet to be influential. Too tied to her past to move on easily. She spends evenings sitting in a courtyard garden, staring at the shade of a fig tree, listening to the distant sound of soldiers training. Because Rome always had soldiers training. Her loneliness becomes routine. Predictable. Almost companion-like. She learns to hold her grief gently, like something fragile. Not because society told her to, society didn't care. But because that was the only way to keep going. Let's slowly transition to another corner of the ancient world. A widow from ancient Persia. Persian society gave women more rights than Greece or Rome, which isn't saying much, but will take the win. A Persian widow's loneliness wasn't just emotional. It was political. Imagine being the wife of a soldier in Xerxes' army. He marches off to Greece in that great empire-expanding attempt that ended. Let's just say, less successfully than planned. You hear rumors that the war went badly. Then worse. Then catastrophically. And finally, someone gives you the news that your husband won't be returning. Persian women could own property, run households, even manage estates. But none of that eased the silence left behind. She might stand on a rooftop terrace at dusk, staring out at the horizon where the sun set behind distant mountains. She would think about how small she felt under the immensity of empire. An empire built by men who marched out proudly. And women who stayed behind quietly. Her life continued. Managing servants, caring for children, overseeing land. But every task had a soft echo of absence. A memory attached to a doorway. A scent on old clothing. A missed footstep in the hall. No crying in public, though. Persian etiquette valued calmness. Composure. So she practiced it. Every day. Until composure became muscle memory. And loneliness became her quiet companion. We'll drift into more ancient worlds soon, Egypt, China, Mesopotamia, the steppe nomads, and eventually royal courts where loneliness was practically a sport. But for now, let's pause here. In the gentle haze of old worlds, with these women who lived in the silence carved by someone else's war,